it is my opinion, I am pretty much agree with the market on this, the market assessment, that the Fed will start some sort of tapering on the 18th. In a way, it won't really matter very much if they don't. Because if they don't taper, you will get a reaction in the markets because it is undoubtedly priced in the bond markets, certainly in the currency markets to a lesser degree, I think. If the markets have an interesting ability to ignore news that is clearly changing and in the background until all of a sudden everything sort of clicks. I'm going to write my column this afternoon on the euro suspended in midair. That's the working title. The idea behind that being that if the Fed is tightening, and I don't care what you say about the Fed funds rate, I'm actually going to talk about this in a minute, that interesting column from Brian Westbury at First Trust. I'm going to use some of his ideas. Whether the Fed funds rate is at 2%, 0.2% or 0.25% as it is now, if market rates are rising, then the Fed is tightening, and the Fed knows that is happening. As I've said many times, quantitative easing is interest rate policy by another name. The Fed can't pay people to borrow money. Well, it could. So, in fact, it's instituted quantitative easing to force market rates to a level where the Fed thinks they'll be more effective at stimulating the economy. It's a good question about whether they've actually been effective. My guess is they're not. So, from the Fed point of view, this is a tightening cycle. There isn't any mistake about this. The Fed doesn't start, I've said this many, many times, but it's something that I think we all need to remember. The Fed is not a casual institution. Its public pronouncements are not off the cuff. They are probably the most carefully considered public issuances of government in the world. Probably the same with the other central banks, the ECB and the BOE. The Bank of Japan, let's say as well. So when the Fed starts way back in May, what it knows will be a tightening cycle. It does so deliberately. It does so in consideration of both its mandates and the risks and rewards of its policies. The Fed has said this many times, but in the back and forth of the markets every day, people tend to lose sight of the baseline, both policy and method of the Fed. I'm not quite a Ben Bernanke fan, but I'm fairly close. But that's another topic. So the Fed has intended to let rates rise, to normalize rates to some degree since late May. Again, Mr. Bernanke is not a casual speaker. His comments are not because he had too many Cabernet Sauvignons at lunch. I don't think that's the way it works. So the Fed has clearly made a judgment, and you have seen a lot of this in the FOMC meeting notes, which, remember, these notes are edited, and they are there to present they are another form of communication. Everything that the Fed does is policy guidance, intentional policy guidance. The minutes are an absolute example of that. When the dissension on the board, the discussion on the FOMC about the risks and the effectiveness, the declining effectiveness of quantitative easing began to show up in the minutes, that wasn't because the court stenographer decided to put them in. It's because the Fed decided to put them in. They were deliberately letting the markets know that the Fed itself had increasing questions about the effectiveness of the policy and the risks of the policy. The effectiveness, I think, is clear. The only real argument for quantitative easing, and it's a relatively strong argument, is a counterfactual argument. Well, things would have been a lot worse if we had not done this. It's a clear judgment from, especially if we look right here. Let me move these things out of the way so I can see them. If we look right here, this part of 2011 right here, this, I think, was the great shock. We got a recovery in 2010, and these are the rates, of course, but it's depicted in this, that faltered mightily. And the Fed began, I think, to get extremely worried about the direction of the economy, and this is QE. This is the major part of QE here. Although we have some over here, these were limited. This is the major part of quantitative easing, which was unlimited. This is an absolute depiction of what the Fed was thinking. So from this period through here, the argument, of course, from the Fed is that it would be much worse. Now, with all of the other, I'm not going to rehearse the whole macroeconomic history of the United States for the past 5 years. We'd be here forever. But remembering Mr. Bernanke's training, and I don't want to make this too personal on Mr. Bernanke because there is certainly an ability for economists and others to operate outside of their own personal, in an analytical mode, outside of their own personal considerations. But one of the lessons from the Depression, which of course we're forgetting now, but the great analogy to the U.S. economy and the world economy post the fall of 2008 was to the Depression. And don't forget, the Depression had from about 30 to maybe 32, had a reasonable recovery, and then it started to falter again. That's the type of, and that's when unemployment got much, much worse. That's the type of analysis, comparison, I think was being made by the Fed. And they did what they thought was correct, and I think it probably was as well, to forestall that. Now, the Fed and low interest rates cannot create growth.